Hey everyone! Today I'll be talking about the emergence of the British opium trade in the 19th century and its impact on the Qing Empire in China. It's a fascinating tale involving smuggling, war, and lots of drugs, but my research focuses mainly on the economic side of things. Since the original paper was 16 pages long, there's no way I can summarize it all today, so I'll be narrowing the focus a bit. The British Empire's relentless commercialization of opium tainted its relations with China, igniting two wars and leading the once proud Qing dynasty to ruin. In order to understand how the opium trade funded one major world power's rise at the expense of another, we must turn our attention to the interconnected economic relationships between the tea, silver, and opium markets. By the late 19th century, the British were completely obsessed with tea. It became an integral part of the British identity. British subjects from all over the world adopted tea drinking into their common culture. As the most imported product in the empire's trading account, the import duties on tea comprised nearly 10% of the British economy's entire revenue, and the best quality tea was grown in China. However, British merchants had a problem. The Chinese refused to trade for British products. They believed that foreign goods were inferior to the ones they produced domestically, and they were also wary of interacting too much with who they labeled as outside barbarians. As a result, the Chinese were more than willing to sell their tea, but only in exchange for silver, which they could use to invest in domestic capital and strengthen their own economy. This resulted in a crippling trade imbalance. The treasury in London was being depleted at an alarming rate. As the silver supply dwindled, British merchants became unable to import enough tea to satisfy the ever-growing demand. The trade deficit between the two countries began to erode the British economy, undermining its other markets and draining it of capital. Meanwhile, the Chinese were struggling with their own, much more sinister addiction. Originally, opium had only been used in China for medicinal purposes, in the form of large, concentrated pills. This changed when Western merchants made their first contact with China and introduced one of Europe's unique customs to Chinese society: smoking. While the Western custom was to smoke tobacco, the Chinese soon discovered that opium could be smoked as well, with powerful, mind-altering effects. The drug's grip on China became stronger as opium dens sprang up across the country. The addiction was not confined to any one group in Chinese society. People from all walks of life were ensnared by the habit, even the emperor himself. Opium began eating away at the fabric of Chinese society. Despite the Qing government's efforts to ban the drug, the black market opium trade was flourishing thanks to foreign merchants and smugglers. Corruption ran rampant. Chinese officials accepted bribes of either money or opium to turn a blind eye to those importing contraband, and as a result, the drug continued to flow freely into the Qing Empire. Exasperated by the continued influx of opium, the imperial court restricted foreign commerce. The aim of the new commercial policy, known as the Canton system, was to isolate foreign imports to the southern port city of Canton. By bottlenecking the flow of opium, the Chinese government hoped to stifle it once and for all. Chinese consumers discovered that the opium produced in British-controlled India was far more potent than what was being produced elsewhere. Demand for British opium rose in spite of the imperial ban. British merchants in Canton were overjoyed. Here, finally, was something the Chinese were willing to trade for. So, the Canton region became the epicenter of the opium trade in China. The British had found a solution for their silver shortage. They would simply trade one addiction for another. Opium was lightweight, small, and easy to transport in mass quantities. It was cheap to produce and worth far more than its weight in gold, making it more lucrative to transport than heavier goods. It would become the new medium of exchange that enabled them to purchase Chinese tea. The East India Company recognized the opium market's potential for netting massive profits. So, they converted several of their cotton plantations in the northeastern regions of India into poppy fields. Now, I could go off on a long tangent about the complicated process of turning a field full of flowers into a potent hallucinogenic drug, but I only have 3 more minutes to talk, so we're just going to skip that bit. The fact that the drug was illegal in China complicated matters. Since the British Empire couldn't directly import opium into the country, they devised an alternative method to subvert the Canton system. Once a batch of opium was ready to sell, the East India Company packed it into crates and sent it to auction houses in major trade hubs like Calcutta and Bombay, where private British merchants bound for China would bid on them. These merchants would take that opium to Lin Tin Island, just off the coast of Canton. This was a rendezvous point for local smugglers, who traded in credit tokens, which functioned like modern checks. While the smugglers distributed the drug to local dealers, bribing port authorities with a cut of their cargo, the British merchants proceeded to Canton, where they would exchange the tokens at credit houses for Chinese silver. Now, they could use this silver to purchase Chinese tea, which they then brought back home to British ports. The imported tea was taxed and then entered British markets for consumption. Through this elaborate process, the British Empire gradually reversed its trade deficit. Soon, the Qing Empire faced deteriorating economic conditions, as silver and tea flowed out of the country as quickly as opium flooded in. The opium trade eventually became a catalyst for conflict. In 1839, the Qing imperial court redoubled its efforts to crush the trade. Their methods became increasingly aggressive, raiding opium dens, imposing harsh penalties on those caught with contraband, and even seizing and destroying foreign merchants' cargo. Their aggressive actions provoked a reprisal from the British Empire, triggering the First Opium War. The war lasted for 3 years, resulting in roughly 500 British casualties and nearly 20,000 Chinese casualties. The Qing Empire was forced to grant extraterritoriality to British merchants, that is, exemption from Chinese laws while on Chinese soil, and to open 5 other ports to foreign trade. They also had to cede the island of Hong Kong to the British. Lingering resentment and the Western powers' desire to unlock further commercial privileges with China led to the outbreak of a second Opium War in 1856, which lasted 4 years and was much more devastating to the Chinese than the first. It was after this defeat that the Qing imperial court was forced to formally legalize the opium trade and make even more humiliating concessions to the Western powers. The legacy of the British opium trade has been decidedly dark. The British Empire prospered as a result of its success, using the profits to fund expansion in the late 19th century. However, China limped into the 20th century in severe economic distress, and with its people facing extreme dependency. By 1906, 23.3% of the adult male Chinese population was addicted to opium. The country suddenly found itself deprived of silver, which left little capital to invest in domestic production. Since the Chinese, as a rule, relied on domestic products rather than foreign imports, this lack of capital was particularly devastating to their economy. In addition, the Opium Wars had opened China to a troubling trend of exploitation at the hands of Western imperialism. And here are my references. Thank you guys so much for listening to my presentation. I'd like to once again thank my advisors, Dr. Wallace and Dr. Tenace, as well as Dr. Beebe, for their guidance on this project. And if anyone has any questions, I'll be happy to take them.